presented by Steve Bochansky, Graham Hall, and Elise Chi, who work in PwC actuarial services in the US and Singapore respectively. Steve is a partner in PwC's actuarial services practice and has more than 23 years of experience in the actuarial field. And he currently leads the US climate risk modeling team. Elise is an actuarial director in Singapore, and she helps insurers achieve financial resilience and creates value through a wide range of audit and advisory work. Graham is a director in PwC in London. I hope I got that right, where he focuses on physical risk modeling, climate change, and related risk management and risk mitigation strategies. And he was part of the establishment of a flood risk pool in the UK. I'll pass over the mic to you guys.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this is Elise from PwC Singapore. Sorry about my screen because I forgot to switch off what my son has switched on, and I'm not going to waste any time. Thank you for having us today, and pleased to be sharing the session with Graham and Steve from my colleagues from PwC US. And what we're going to speak about today, that's climate change. It needs no introduction. And if you have tuned into yesterday's session, you would have heard the regulator stating that climate risk is going to be a key risk that will be on top of their radar screen. And you can expect a lot more regulatory development that's coming up in this space. All right, next slide, please. Graham. Yeah, so to sort of set the stage for what Graham and Steve are going to share about next, I'm going to give you a sort of a snapshot, an overview of the regulatory and reporting landscape with regards to climate risk and climate risk management that's applicable to insurers in Singapore. And then Steve and Graham will take you through TCFD framework and what are the key risks with regards to climate change management, and how do you actually factor that in your climate risk assessment and risk modeling. Yeah, next please. All right, let's get to this. Yeah. Okay, so it's the regulatory developments and regulations, the only push and driver for insurers that focusing on environmental risk. Well, not quite, because there are many other stakeholders within the ecosystem that it's also pushing insurers to consider climate risk management or environmental risk management. And the rating agencies are one of them. So you have the likes of MSCI and Fitch, and they are increasingly factoring sustainability risk factors or climate risk exposure in their rating methodologies. And you have seen, say, MSCI, Fitch coming up with ESG ratings as well, which the investors are very keen to consider in their asset allocation and selection. And in large institutional investors as well, they're putting a lot of pressure on companies to act on climate change. You can see that from BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street as being examples of them. And at the end of the other spectrum, your policyholders and the customers are also focusing on sustainability and climate risk. And studies have shown that more than 73% of millennials are changing their buying habits with the environmental in mind. So you can see that kids with my screen at the back. And my daughter just told me the other day, that I should stop using the brand of shampoo that I've been using. And well, that's because, she said she intentionally Googled about it. And she realized that, the company that manufactures the shampoo has been sued in the UK because they have introduced an ingredient in the shampoo that's very damaging to the environment. So you can see that the consumer habits are changing, especially among the younger generation and the millennials. And you would expect the same, as they make their consumption choices with regards to financial services, just like insurance. All right, next slide, please. So this slide gives you sort of a backdrop of the kind of governmental push or development with regards to climate risk management and sustainability in the financial sector in Singapore. Now, things sort of ramped up in the last 2 years, and you see in November 2020, the MES actually announced the Green Finance Action Plan and a $2 billion public sector commitment to green investments. And there were a series of actions that triggered from that. What is relevant to us is in December 2020, MES releases guidelines on environmental risk management. And there are 3 sets of guidelines, one for the insurers, one for the banks, one for the asset managers. And insurers have 18 months from 2020 December to comply with the set of guidelines. So if you count the dates, you will have actually up to 6 months more, right? So by end of June 2022, you should have more or less set in place the requirements to meet the requirements in the guidelines. And in August this year, SGX also released a consultation paper proposing that for all entities that's listed on the SGS, sustainability reporting is mandatory. And it has to be audited as well by either the internal auditors or the external auditors. And there has been development on carbon trading as well. And in September, just 2 months ago, our finance minister, Lawrence Wong, has announced that carbon tax is going to increase in the future. So it's going to be going up from $5 per ton of CO2 to $15 per ton. So it's still a far cry from the $100 per ton that you see in certain European countries. But this is similar to GST, right? It can only go up. It's not likely to come down. All right, next slide, please. Next, grant. Yeah, so there's a lot of regulatory development and updates across various spectrum in Singapore, covering many different industries. But what is more relevant to us will be the SGX guidelines on sustainability reporting and the fact that it is mandatory, and MES environmental risk guidelines. Now, it's just not going to stop here at environmental risk guidelines, okay? The MES will be slowly and surely introducing more regulatory expectations, especially with regards to climate risk disclosure and climate risk management scenario testing, as well as the wider sustainability reporting disclosures, and the fact that that there is a general consensus and belief that to seek for assurance for such reporting as well. And the TCFT framework is something that interests here would have to pay attention to. That will be sort of the go-to standard that SGX and MES will defer to for sustainability reporting and climate-related disclosure. There is also the science-based targets, or SBTI, that you would like to read up on or pay attention to. And that is for companies who would like to make the net zero commitment. So if you intend to make the net zero commitment, then this SBTI will provide sort of the framework and the recommendations for you to do so, for you to sort of map out the future pathways for you to achieve net zero. And this should be aligned with the 1.5 degrees increase in global temperature by 2050. I think on the 10th of November, they have released a consultation paper stating the guidelines or the recommendations for the financial service sector, which you might want to take a look as well. Next, please, go ahead. Next slide, yeah. So I won't be going into greater details of the environmental risk guidelines, which I believe most of us would be familiar by now. But this is a set of guidelines. It's not a regulation. So although in principle it may not be mandatory, but there is regulatory expectation, especially for the mid to larger insurers, to comply with this set of guidelines. And minimally, MES would expect insurers to put in place sort of a framework to address or to manage or sort of environmental risk management framework, and sets out roles and responsibilities of your senior management, and with some board oversight on environmental risk management as well. And they, of course, would understand that the other technical areas like underwriting, investments, and stress testing, scenario analysis will be sort of work in progress due to evolving global standards. Well, also minimally, they would expect us to provide some sort of a disclosure. And disclosure is an area where you can expect more regulatory updates going forward, especially next year. Next slide. There is also a handbook that has been compiled by the industry. That's a task force that's convened by MES. which actually is a useful reference for insurers to meet the requirements in the environmental risk guidelines, which you may want to take a look as well. This was issued in January this year. Yeah, next. Okay, so to sum up my sharing, I just wanted to share about one of the latest development that is important and that will impact insurers going forward. And it is sort of following COP26. COP means Conference of Parties, not COP as in policeman COP. So at the COP26, which just ended recently, IFRS actually announced the formation of ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board. Now, in the past, there are many different sustainability reporting standards. So it's almost like an alphabet soup. You know, you have your CDP, your CDSB, and so on, and you just pick and choose what you want. But IFRS actually responded to the call and it set up the ISSB, which by doing so, it sort of globalized, and uniform sustainability standards. So it sort of consolidates some of these reporting standards under one. And there are two prototypes that has been issued on climate-related disclosures, which you may want to take a look. And with this, the standard should be more or less on track to introduce the first climate standard in 2022. So what does it mean for you insurers? So with the increased focus from MAS, especially on climate-related disclosure and sustainability reporting from SGX, and with ISB forming as well, I think it is important for all insurers to start taking action and review your climate-related disclosures, especially in your financial statements, in your reporting, and to take active steps, to improve the quality of your disclosure. So don't sweep things under the carpet. I know insurers have made, but this is one of the things that you can run, but you can't hide. And going forward, you can expect your auditors to be assessing the risk of material statements in your financial statements with regards to climate-related impact. And with that, I'm going to stop my very funny video, and I'll just pass the time to Graham and Steve. All right, take over, please. Thanks.
Great, Elise. Thanks very much. That was a whirlwind tour through the regulatory and sort of public landscape of pressure related to ESG and climate risk. Excuse me. I think what strikes me most about what Elise just ran us through is how quickly things have evolved and really picked up speed. A lot of the things that she mentioned have really taken off within the last 12 to 18 months. And so things are changing and happening very quickly. Probably would have been good to have happened sooner, but there's just so much momentum right now when it comes to ESG and climate reporting. So we're going to focus on one aspect of that, which is the TCFD, and TCFD stands for the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. I think when Elise mentioned the alphabet soup of different standards that are out there for ESG reporting in the climate risk space, this is one area where we see a lot of alignment around the TCFD framework as the emerging standard on how to report on climate-related risks and opportunities. So what is the TCFD? So the TCFD is a group that was formed by the Financial Stability Board under the leadership of the G20. I believe it was formed in 2015 and came out with a set of recommendations around climate-related disclosures in 2017. Has been optional, and now you can see is starting to be adopted as mandatory reporting in many jurisdictions. So chaired by Michael Bloomberg, it's got the support of many industry leaders, and you can see on the right, 2,600 organizations that have announced their support for the guidelines. And the purpose of the recommendations were to start to provide investors and others in the public with relevant information about climate-related risks and opportunities that are embedded within different types of organizations. In terms of the background, I think the FSB saw the financial crisis of 2008 and wanted to get ahead and sort of saw climate risk as the next potential global systemic crisis. And so the TCFD was formed and put out a series of recommendations. So Graham, next slide, we can talk through the different components of the TCFD recommendations. So there's four main components. We're going to go through each of these in a bit more detail on the following slides, but the four categories are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And so the framework really attempts to lay out a comprehensive view within an organization of climate-related risks and opportunities and how they're managed and tracked by different organizations. So let's dig into each of these in a bit more detail. So the governance component is really focused on board oversight and management's role in identifying, understanding, and managing climate-related risks and opportunities. We talk about with that piece how frequently the board is informed of climate-related risks and opportunities. Are there key people within the management team who are responsible for climate-related risks and opportunities, and so forth. The strategy piece is all about how the climate-related risks and opportunities might impact an organization's business strategy, including their financial strategy. So this is the piece where we start to look at climate-related risks and opportunities and start to do both qualitative and ultimately qualitative risk assessments and then quantitative scenario analysis to support management of those climate-related risks. Typically, and we'll go through this in a bit more detail as well, but typically with the quantitative scenario analysis, you are looking at multiple different potential future warming scenarios over a variety of time horizons. And you can imagine, within the insurance industry, particularly in the life insurance industry, companies are used to looking out that far into the future when they're looking at their risks. But for non-life, typically the time horizons are shorter. For non-insurance companies, their planning horizons are typically much shorter than the time horizons that we're looking for a climate-related scenario analysis. So, we'll talk about the role of actuaries in the climate risk space. I can tell you that while Graham and I are doing a lot of work for insurers, we're also doing a lot of work for outside the insurance industry, for energy companies, for mining companies, for retail companies. And so the type of scenario analysis that we're used to doing and the skills that we bring to the table as actuaries are extremely relevant when it comes to this type of long range scenario analysis. Graham, next slide. Next component is risk management, and this is all about how climate-related risks are integrated into the risk management framework of an organization. This is an area where I think if you look at the most recent TCFD status report, which I think the prior slide referenced the report from 2020, 2021 report was just released in October, and the risk management piece in terms of disclosures of the risk management practices is one area that the insurance industry is leading, and not surprising because we do have very sophisticated and well-formed risk management frameworks that we manage to. I could tell you from working with some other industries, though they are not always as well-formed as we have in the insurance industry. So probably an area that that others can learn from what we've had to have in place up to this time. And then in terms of metrics and targets, this is really about what are the metrics companies are using to assess those risks and opportunities, and what targets are they managing to. Within this piece is also the recommended disclosure of Scope 1, Scope 2, and if appropriate, Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And that in itself is a pretty sophisticated and oftentimes challenging exercise. So, and it's just one component of the TCFD recommendations. So that's a little bit of an overview of what the TCFD, I won't say requires, but in some cases is required, but what the TCFD framework lays out and recommends. Let's talk a little bit more about the risk framework within the TCFD. This is one of the components of the TCFD that I really like because I think it does a really nice job of laying out, and it provides a nice framework for how to think about the different risks that may manifest from climate change. So I'm going to start in the middle with the physical risk because I think those are very intuitive for most of us at least. So the physical risk related to climate change is what we always hear about in the news, whether it's acute risk from extreme weather events or chronic risks, like from things like rising sea levels, rising mean temperatures. The physical risks, I think we're all very comfortable with. This notion of transition risk is new in the climate space, and I think it's something that, at least in my discussions with clients, they're not always as familiar or comfortable with. So transition risk is the notion that as we transition to a low carbon economy, different companies will be affected in different ways, and both from both risks and opportunities. You can imagine as we see an increase in the frequency and the level of carbon taxes, that'll affect different industries. Obviously, energy companies, oil and gas companies will be affected more heavily than others. And so we break down transition risk into these 4 subcategories of policy and legal, technology risks, market risks, and reputational risks. So in the insurance space, on the non-life side, you would expect the physical risks to probably be the most, or maybe the more severe of the 2 categories. In the life insurance space, I think sometimes clients we speak to maybe aren't as concerned with the physical risks, although I would argue that some of the chronic physical risks could actually start to have quite a significant impact. But the transition risks, if you think about the investment portfolios of life insurance companies, that's really where the most extreme, particularly the market risk within their investment portfolios, companies that they're invested in that face risk from transition to a low carbon economy. So there's a lot here for insurers to be concerned about, and a lot to be focused on in the scenario analysis. And then on the opportunity side as well, you can see different categories here of climate related opportunities. We think in the insurance space, there's some interesting opportunities related to new products. I did catch the tail end of the prior presentation on parametric insurance, and we think there's potential for companies to start writing new products or developing new products that are specifically targeted at climate related impacts and some of the physical manifestations of climate related risks. So this is another nice feature of the TCFD framework, is that it does focus on both risks and opportunities. It also gives companies a lot of flexibility for sort of how to write their reports, how to tell their story when it comes to ESG and climate risk. And so it does give you a lot of flexibility to focus on risks and opportunities that are most relevant to you. In terms of the approach that we typically see companies taking for a TCFD assessment, it's sort of these 3 steps. So the first step is to do a qualitative risk assessment, and this is starting with that risk framework that we just saw, risk and opportunity framework that we just saw, working with the people within the organization that understand the business the best, and could do a qualitative assessment, typically a high, medium, low type assessment of where the risks might manifest, where some of the opportunities may present themselves as well. Once you've done a qualitative assessment and sort of identified what you think are the most significant risks, then you would move into a scenario testing exercise. And in the scenario testing exercise for insurers, we always recommend that insurers focus on 3 pieces. So one is the asset portfolio. I just mentioned that typically transition risk is the bigger category for the asset portfolio, though physical risk is also a consideration to the extent that you're invested in real estate and other physical assets. The second piece would be the underwriting portfolio. So how will climate related risks and opportunities affect your products? And you could do this with typical stress testing type approaches that you use for economic capital or other exercises. And lastly, the operational impact. So this is what's the impact on your physical buildings, offices, other facilities. We often recommend and see companies also assessing the risk of their employees' home locations, because if you have high risk offices, you typically are going to have employees that live close to the office and therefore likely also live in high risk locations. And while most companies have business continuity plans that cover their offices and facilities, they typically don't cover employee home locations. So something to consider there. And then the last piece is then incorporating that into your your risk management framework. And I think we're going to talk, we've got a next slide kind of talks about different ways to embed climate-related risks into the ERM framework. And there's a few different options there, Graham, if we jump to the next page. So the first option here in terms of embedding climate risk is to treat it as a standalone risk, similar to other types of risk, market insurance, operational risks. That's not typically the way that we see most companies approaching this today, but potential for that to change in the future as things start to materialize and get more severe. The second option would be to recognize climate change risk as a sub-risk category under an existing risk category. Again, we see that less frequently, but again, you could see that becoming a more popular option as the risks start to manifest. So the third option is really the way that we see most companies treating climate risk right now. You can think of it as almost like a multiplier of the other existing risk types. So climate change has an impact on credit, has an impact on market risk, it has an impact on insurance risk, and so forth. And so some different options for how to think about embedding climate risk into the ERM framework, but certainly to this point, option 3 is what we've seen most commonly. So that's a little bit of a spin through the TCFD recommendations and some thoughts about the different types of climate risk that manifest. And Graham is going to describe a bit more about how we go about conducting scenario analysis for climate change.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, just to build on what Steve said, I guess what we're going to talk about here is scenario analysis. This is one of the key tenets of the TCFD framework under the strategy pillar. And so it's also the most challenging part and the part that companies are struggling to make the most progress with. But I think as actuaries, it's probably one of the most interesting areas as well. So from an underwriting perspective here, these are just some considerations that companies might take into account, non-life companies specifically, when they're thinking about what climate change might do to their underwriting portfolio. So just some consideration on the left there, as I said, but questions like, well, given my current portfolio today, and maybe the total insured values I'm tracking to, or the underwriter limits that are in place, how would that change over time if I was under a 2-degree scenario or a 4-degree scenario? That sort of brings the considerations of catastrophe modeling in, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But the general idea is that you're thinking about a climate-adjusted portfolio and what that might look like. And then the question then becomes how you might adjust your underwriting and pricing today such that you can build the portfolio you want in the future. Now, this is something that companies in the United States consider specifically, because here, in order to price risks, you have to have those approved by local DOIs. And it's also difficult to pull out of writing business in certain states based on those local insurance regulators. So it's easy to say, oh, well, if the losses get too high, then we'll either increase our pricing or we'll just pull out of writing that business. But it's not as straightforward as that. It can sometimes take time to withdraw from a state, take time to change pricing, and indeed take time to build an ideal portfolio that you're interested in. So taking all that into account from a climate change perspective is what we're seeing kind of leading companies do. And then the final point on the left here is around the reinsurance strategy. This sort of links to the prior talk that we had and Steve's comment about new insurance products, but thinking about your appetite for risk in a climate adjusted scenario and what that means for how much risk you retain and how much you transfer. From an operational perspective, again, building on what Steve said, but I think what we're seeing leaders do is think about where their staff are located, where their offices are located, maybe other important corporate locations as well, such as data centers, and looking at the current risks of those locations and how that risk again might change over time under climate adjusted scenarios. And what we've also seen leaders do is think about the implications for their staff and their workforce. And this links to kind of other pillars in the ESG framework, thinking about social as well, how you're looking after your people and how you're telling that story externally. So just thinking about physical risks, what we have on here is some comments or thoughts around how climate change may impact the manifestation of certain perils. Generally, the complexity of integrating climate change into peril modeling depends on how closely the perils are linked to global warming, or the concept of a warming climate. So if we're thinking about heat waves, then the link between the frequency and severity of heat waves is easier to model, and some of those results come straight out of the climate models that have been developed, than say the impact on hurricanes. And you can see here the impact on hurricanes is complex. And when we're thinking about what we expect from a climate adjusted scenario, it's not necessarily straightforward. We generally would expect more severe hurricanes, but they may be slower moving. There's also this concept that we're expecting hurricanes to track further north than they may have done previously. And then finally, sea level rise will mean that storm surge type events and losses may also be magnified. The other question is, and I'll get onto this, if we're thinking about current event sets that catastrophe modeling companies use, are those sufficient? Or are there events missing from those event sets? So for example, is there a potential in the future to have a Cat 6 hurricane, which we've never seen before? So when we're thinking about how this would be modeled, there's a couple of ways that that companies are allowing for climate change in their catastrophe models. Both AIR and RMS have released methodologies for how they are starting to do it. I won't go through all the details, but essentially there's two ways that companies are thinking about it. First of all is adjusting the event set. So that's essentially taking the existing event set and adjusting the frequencies of the existing events, kind of consistent with what I mentioned on the prior slide. This would not necessarily allow for those unmodeled events, let's call them, events that are not in the current event set, but it would say, given my current event set, how can I make that more representative of a future climate scenario, either a high warming or a low scenario? I think we're going to share these slides with you so you can go into some of the details, but both RMS and AIR have released papers explaining how they propose to do it based on the models coming out of the climate change scenario models. And what you can see is that the AALs are very much increasing, and so we are expecting, which seems intuitive, higher modeled losses given climate change. The other methodology that companies are using, and this is a kind of more straightforward method, I would say, or at least more of an easy method to get your hands around in the shorter term, is thinking about a kind of top-down adjustment to the results of the models. So this essentially is taking an EP curve or some PMLs and stressing those based on a certain percentage. And this good paper from the UNFFI talks about a framework for doing that and how you might start to come up with some of those as percentage to adjust the results. This might be more consistent or familiar to insurers who are already used to doing this to allow for kind of non-modeled losses or secondary perils. But the framework and how you come up with those factors is new, contemplating climate change. And then my final slide, this is around how you might think about the impacts on an asset portfolio, thinking about transition risk. This is quite a complex modeling exercise, but there are scenarios that exist from companies or from organizations like the IEA or the NGFS, which start to address how macroeconomic variables may change under the presence of certain climate scenarios. These are typically driven by the idea of an introduction of a carbon price, which would be levied on companies on their scope 1 and 2 emissions, and what that might do to their macroeconomic performance and how that then cascades down through the economy. But essentially the idea would be that you, as an insurer, would take your asset portfolio and understand the potential impact of those risks on the asset portfolio and what that might do to the change in valuation of those assets, and therefore what that means for either your asset underwriting or selection process, and ultimately your investment management strategy as well. All right, that's all of the slides we have. I also want to clarify, I'm actually in the United States and not in the UK, otherwise it would be 2:15 a.m. in the morning. And whilst I'm excited to be presenting to you guys, that might be a little bit of a stretch. I don't know if there's any questions, Velda, that we would have time. I know we're a little bit over time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that as well. So thank you, Lee, Steve, and Graham for taking us through the regulations, modeling of climate risk. I guess I could just start the ball rolling before the Q&A starts coming in. I guess, have you done like your operational stress testing approach in Singapore? Has it been done in Asia?
Yeah, we have, I'm trying to think, we have not done it specifically in Asia. And I think that the actual modeling of the approach and the perils that you would allow for would obviously differ, which is where the local modeling expertise is required, right? Because we have different types of events in the Pacific Basin as opposed to in the United States. So you need to make sure that the modeling is done appropriately. What I would say is that the climate models do cover the full scope of the globe. The granularity of them differs depending on where you're thinking about modeling. But generally the models from the IPCC, which are the primary physical risk models used, do have global coverage.
Maybe just let me add on to that. So we may not have specifically done it for insurers in Asia. That's because for the insurance sector, things have just been warming up quite recently with the introduction of the MAS environmental risk guidelines. So the insurers are still in the process of a discovery phase, to find out what is it that is required. Although some of the larger insurers and reinsurers, they do have their internal models and do have started the process probably much earlier. But within Singapore, we have done risk modeling, especially transition risk modeling, for the non-insurance sector. So we have done it for real estate and so on. And of course, the models for real estate is probably slightly simpler compared to an insurance entity. Yeah, but of course, our clients are beginning to take a serious look at this and reaching us out for assistance and help currently. I think Velda, you're on mute.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yep, I think thank you for that question. Yeah, for that. Okay, there's one.
I think there's one question for me. Yeah.
Life insurers be more concerned with transition risk than physical risk? What long-term physical risk should they be concerned with?
Okay, so we have maybe let me answer that, and Graham and Steve, who are probably the experts, can sort of chip in. So when we talk about physical risk, we always pay attention to destruction of property, right, and so on, flooding and stuff like this, which probably Graham and Steve can expound more on. But physical risk for life insurance include more than just that. It also has it also covers mortality outgo that comes from, say, heat waves and global warming. But you probably tend to see less of that in Singapore compared to other geographical regions like, say, Australia or in California, where there's severe heat waves. But it does cover that as well. And it's likely to be less of an acute risk, but it's probably more chronic in nature. And it does cover a wider spectrum. Say you have the pandemic, biodiversity loss, and change in temperature, change in geographical locations, and migration. And so on, that impacts more than the person, the attendee who raised the question, that for life insurers currently, and even for pension companies, right, you tend to focus on transition risk because that is probably the bulk that hits you most, and it's probably more complicated to model than the physical risk. It covers a wide spectrum, and you have to take into consideration changes in litigation and changes in the legal landscape, the government regulatory push, and it's quite uncertain where the regulation is likely to go sometimes, because the kind of a regulatory push that you see in Europe, in America, might be different from what you see in APAC. And even in APAC, it's quite diverse, because what China is doing is likely to be different from what Singapore is doing. Yeah, and you also have a lot of uncertainty that comes with technological innovation and progress as well, which are all considered as part of transition risk. So agree that life insurers tend to focus on that, but there will be still a subset of physical risk, as I've described, which probably needs more global development and more data to collate and to study and analyze before we could size up this risk for the Asian context.
Yeah, at least I can just maybe reiterate what you said. We looked in the life insurance space, we typically look at long-term impacts on mortality and morbidity. And this is largely driven by mean temperature increases. Heat waves is in fact a big factor there. Also droughts and sort of water scarcity. But someone mentioned in the comments that the other piece is infectious diseases and insect-borne diseases, and what academic research is showing about potential increases or more frequency in those diseases because of warmer temperatures. Those are the areas that we tend to focus on.
Okay, maybe the last question, we'll just touch on it. Is there a consensus on the impacts of climate change on hurricanes or cyclones?
I think there is a lot of research still ongoing. So I wouldn't say that there's an overall consensus in exactly the physical effects. The understanding is developing. But what I would say is that based on historical data that we've seen and also projection models, there is definitely a consensus about the general way that the impact will go directionally. And that is that events will typically get stronger, but some of the frequencies might reduce. But what I would say is that there are a variety of papers that continue to be developed, and the scientific understanding is certainly not concluded and continues to get deeper.
Yeah, I think what I've seen is the frequency question is less certain. The severity, just the amount of water that storms will hold, and therefore the impact of flooding events is more well established to be connected with climate change.
Thank you. Thank you once again for staying on so late as well in the US. And yeah, hopefully we definitely learn more about climate change now, as well as the current regulations in Singapore. We'll definitely have a read through because it was quite fast on that. So yeah,